Welcome to Mono Tutorials. In this session we'll be looking at building the Auditorium for the third and final session. We'll be looking at updating the lighting, refining the base model, adding a custom skybox, adding canvases, adding a mirror, custom Lightmap UVs, and animating floor textures, as well as just wrapping up the space. Let's jump in. So the first thing we're going to be looking at is just improving the light probes, making sure that the stage itself has enough light probes for the more bright environment that you want to bring attention to the avatars that are on there. Once again, those will be updated with the light mapping approach, which we'll do a couple of times. And once again, I'll just skip through that process because each time was about 20 minutes. I will note that because the space is quite a simple design, the light mapping did need to be improved, so I increased the samples and things like that. And I'll probably look at putting some of the results in the tutorials once I get that all up and done. Here we start looking at refining the model itself, putting a light at the top of the main auditorium to sort of brighten that up a little bit. We also look at creating sort of like a skylight or an area that branches out into the outside, which requires a custom skybox. So going to Polyhaven in regards to their HDRIs, grabbing one that is kind of bright and cheerful, I guess, and then adding that into the space using sort of by modifying the texture to a cube and then applying it to a material that has a skybox cube map. Note that the default settings will apply the skybox lighting or intensity to the light mapping information. Now, I found it depends on if you use baked indirect, subtractive, or shadow mask in regards to the shadows of the skybox. So in some cases, you might need to create the other side of the wall, and others you don't need to. I also adjust the intensity of the skybox itself to adjust the lighting to something that I was a bit more happy with. As noted, all of the materials, generally, if you're using a default shader, is one-sided. The light will go through it on one side, but be blocked on the other. So if you're creating any environments that need a shadow, then you will actually need the polygons to represent that. So that's why I'll do that. At this point, I add a few canvases. We do want sort of like a small gallery in there so we can showcase people's work. We also want to put a canvas showing how to use a space. A lot of users come into a space and they don't really know how to use it, and they don't seem to read the tutorial that we have in the space. So having it in the space will basically force them to pay attention to what's going on. Next up is a mirror. This was an idea that we came up in discussions with the team looking at running this space. And a lot of people that, especially with VRM spaces, where, for example, you can download or use different VRMs, they will put in a mirror effect so you can sort of see what you look like. So basically, I added one of these, use this with camera and render to texture technique. I'll probably get this up in the tutorials as well. You can use an orthographic sort of viewport, or with a little bit of wrangling, you can get a perspective in there as well, which I tweak in a second. In the end, we decided to get rid of that though, just because we do want this to be more performant, and it didn't really bring that much to the space. So yeah, just decided to put another canvas in that location. I think it's very important when you're looking at a limited resource space to make sure that anything you have in that space is going towards the goal. Is it entertaining? Does it align with the theme of the space? Whatever enhances the space itself. It's a really good way to keep your goal oriented, but also make sure that all of the resources that you are allowed to use are used in ways that makes your space or experience, more the point, all the better. Now notice here that I start cutting up different parts of the space. In this case, the sort of external walls, because I don't want that to be included in the light map texture itself. So to do that, I can just split it off and make that not static. This will save a lot of the texture space in the light map, and because those usually add quite a bit to the file size due to the scale of that asset, there are ways to scale a model inside a light map if you want to go that way, but in this case I don't want it in it at all. So making sure that I can separate the objects to things that require light mapping and things that don't require light mapping, or more the point, aren't used in the light mapping texture. But you can adjust the settings so you can choose which does what accordingly as you see fit. So that's all in the docs as needed. So that's why I'm looking at doing that with this approach. Note that I probably wouldn't look at light mapping as a first space. It is a whole ecosystem of things to do, and it takes a while because light mapping, depending on the space, can take anywhere from 5 minutes to 45 minutes, even an hour and a half in some cases, so definitely case by case. I've actually spent a lot of time working on this space's lighting. Because most of this space is using plain walls and floors, the lighting is kind of very important in regards to getting it right. So playing with the colors, playing with the intensities, playing with basically the direction of some of the spotlights on the stage, all of these play a part in sort of looking the way I want it to. And it does take a while, unfortunately. But the payoff is definitely worth it. This is where I start looking at creating my own custom light maps. Unity does okay at creating or unpacking Lightmap UVs, and to do that you press Generate Lightmap UVs on the model itself. That said, because this space is quite white and a lot of plain space, I definitely wanted to optimize the Lightmap UVs to be as optimal as possible. So in doing so, in Blender anyway, creating a second UV map on, I think, at the Object Data tab, and then optimizing the second UVs to fit in the square as tightly as possible. And that way we can make the UVs use more space as needed. And once it light maps this information, it has more room to create. Therefore, the quality of that will be better. It does take a little while. Unwrapping is always a bit of a pain. Some people hate it. I don't mind it, actually. I find it's kind of like a box version of Tetris, but it kind of has to be done. There are plugins for Blender and, of course, other applications that do it for you. Turning off the Generate Lightmap UVs on the model when you import it will make sure that when it bakes, the light mapping, it uses what you set it as rather than Unity doing it for you. I have noticed that the space isn't as good as I would like it to be with the light mapping quality. Once again, very simple, very plain. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out the best settings for light mapping. In this case, the filtering was the biggest issue. So I did play with that a fair bit in regards to try to getting that light map quality as good as possible on what would be such a sort of a simple space. So you can see sort of like noise, and most of that came down to the sampling and the filtering. You'll note that, well, if you can notice it at, like, 6 times speed, those settings are played with a fair bit to get the right result. You'll note there that I added the perspective to the camera and then moved it back and then adjusted the clipping range to get that effect. This has a much better effect on the overall result of the mirror being perspective based rather than orthographic. So that worked a lot better. Then, of course, some more tweaks to the model to adjust the lighting in the space. So when you're using emissive for lighting, you have to consider how much light is portrayed and bounced around the environment. So if that top section was a bit thicker, that would be a lot of light, and therefore the environment would be extremely bright. So that's how I adjusted that. In this section, I basically start looking at readjusting the second light map again. This time I break up these two elements into separate sections to making two 2048 by 2048 light map textures. That way you basically double the quality of the texture, and same thing again, just trying to squeeze it all into that 0 to 1 box as much as possible. Basically want to make sure that none of the objects overlap and all of the space of it is as big as possible. You could possibly scale them in different directions. I'll be considering some of those thinner elements on the stairs, for example. I could make it a little bit bigger so it fits, once again, more of the information in there to be a bit cleaner. As noted thousands of times before, it's always a balance between what you want to do, what you can do, depending on how many people you get in there, and things like that. So choosing the elements that you need, and sometimes the things that you want is definitely part of the battle. One thing to think about when creating your space is how do you communicate what the space is as soon as someone gets into the space. I think some of the best spaces I've seen have sort of like a billboard that you spawn next to, so you could have a really nice welcoming point to the space. Now, I've already mentioned the canvas to the left of the door that you get into. That is a close enough position that it can be instantly seen once you jump in, so you can sort of see what's happening with the space. But soon I'll be adding another canvas that allows the host to add a canvas that represents what the event is going to be. So this allows the event to kind of have a more dynamic setup when people coming into the space, so they know they're in the right place and that there is an event being held, and that all creates a more welcoming situation when you get into the space. Now notice here that I grab the canvas and scale the unique name canvas asset, or in this case gallery 2, to 0.16 by 0.09 in order to get the ratio of a very common image size. That way we can make sure that the canvases used on that invite or that billboard are very common, sort of 1920 by 1080 ratio. I can then just scale it up usually, and that'll keep the ratio as needed. Make sure not to scale the parent canvas object. It's always the unique name object under that. One of the last things that I look at is basically sort of creating a visual guide for new users to come in and automatically know where they're meant to go. So in this case, I was using sort of like an animated texture to sort of have a guide arrow through animation. So in that case, using the UV in interesting ways to make it very clear what they need to do. So basically walk forward and then around the gallery to the auditorium for the event. So this section goes over creating that model, unwrapping it so you have a one-directional animation tool, if that makes sense. So the UV, if you animated the texture or the material in Unity, will move forward, and therefore it will flow in one line, for example. So making sure, and I did make the mistake where I actually adjusted the Lightmap UV rather than the base UV, but once I figured that out, basically sort of setting that up so that it does the UVs correctly. Assign it to a new material so that we can animate that one, and then putting that in the space. So in a moment, you'll see that I'll jump into Photoshop and create a very simple gradient texture. That texture will sort of animate upwards, and because of how the UV map was done, it will look like it's flowing around the space. So you can do some really interesting effects with that one thing. And I've used it in several of my spaces by just animating that one texture. I find that the loop is a little too many. So I go back into Blender and scale the UV so it adjusts according to the texture. I found that actually a very powerful tool in regards to designing spaces, knowing that you can create a model to the texture and a texture to the model, and everything in between allows you a little bit more creativity with how you develop things. I learned this a lot in regards to using trim sheets, and then just expanding that a lot in regards to creating objects that have tiny textures with simple colors to full trim sheets, so complicated objects with very interesting details. So using those techniques and understanding each one separately allows you to create some very powerful results by putting them together. And that wraps up our Minotaurium, or Monotaurium, I think we've renamed it too. So in this project, I learned stuff myself, focusing on the filtering and sampling on the light maps, because that had to be focused on. Usually because you have textures and things like that, the light mapping is less obvious, so you can sort of get away with a few more mistakes. But in this case, it was very flat, very clear, so I really had to lean into learning about the light mapping process. I think this applies to every single space you make. If you're just beginning, a lot of spaces are very difficult because you're learning Blender, you're learning Unity, and basically creating a space that teaches you the things that you need to learn is kind of the skill. That's where the fun is, to be honest. So make sure that you're setting your projects to the scope that you currently have, and don't try to do all of the things at once. So, of course, the main thing that you'll need to learn is probably how to create assets, so just focus on that. Just make a cool, interesting, simple space that allows you to learn how to create a sofa, how to create some walls, how to create a door. After that, you can maybe look at a different space that includes light mapping and light probes. Those two sort of work together a lot. And then, yeah, just going through all the docs that we have and pick the things that interest you for the tasks that you need. Of course, you can always jump into the Discord for support, or even just join the community making amazing things, or join many of the weekly events that we run. And with that, let's wrap it up. Hope you had fun. Happy building.